you're not in a position to do that, if you're not in a position to do that, please don't worry about it. Get as much material as you can. We do record these sessions and send them out to participants along with our slides following today's conversation so that you'll have them for reference as you move forward. So please feel free to take notes, but also know you will get slides and so forth after the fact. If at any point during today's conversation you do have questions that I can answer for you, don't hesitate to just throw those in the chat. I do typically try to take questions as we go along. I do always leave some time at the end for follow-up questions or something that maybe came to somebody's mind at the end of the presentation. But there will be time for questions, and don't hesitate to answer those. Along those lines, I actually do shut off the recording at the end when we do have questions, so that if you have a question you prefer not to have recorded, there's an opportunity to do that as well. So those are just some of our logistics as we get into our material today. But where I'm really, for those of you that I have not met before, to give you a little bit of background on sort of who we are, what we do, and particularly my background in this space of interviewing. I have been in HR since the day I graduated college. That 20 plus is starting to get a little bit closer to that 30 years mark at this stage, but have worked in the HR space my entire career. That includes 12 years where I actually was the recruiting director for Progressive Insurance, specialized in their claims and contact center hiring, but have done recruiting in many different spaces. In addition to that, I started the firm 10 years ago, and now our team supports our clients in all things HR. We have a recruiting team that serves as our talent advisors to help support client recruiting needs. We also have a team that specializes in what you traditionally think of as HR, employee relations, employee handbooks, job descriptions. How does your team work together? And then we also offer leadership development options and team development options to really help. Again, our goal is to help teams create great workplaces that make people happy and also allow them to meet their business goals and business objectives along the way. We will have people today in this session from a lot of different industries. We support a variety of industries. About a third of our clients come from the landscape space. We also have a large portion of our folks that come from nonprofit association management, and then everything you can imagine in between. So I will use examples throughout today's work from a large variety of our client base, so to help make sure that everybody gets some frame of reference as we're going along. All right. So one of the questions I love to ask, and again, folks can throw their answers in the chat if they're able to, but right, it often feels out of place for folks to really start with the conversation around like, what gets in the way of interviewing? But as opposed to starting with here's how you do it and here's some of the obstacles, I like to flip the conversation. And one of the easiest ways to think about sometimes the obstacles is to come at it from food, because food often is a good example for how we see life. So I'd love for folks to think about, what is a food you hate, even though you've never tasted it? So go ahead and throw some answers in a chat, but a food that you hate, even though you've never tasted it. And while I'm waiting for answers to come in, I will tell you this list for me is quite long, which is probably why it's so easy for it to resonate for me, because I am an absolute fiend about, like, my husband laughs. My list is long of things that it can be color, it can be texture, it can be the name of the word, right? So we've got some ideas, liver, artichoke hearts. I will tell on myself because my team often does. If I go to a barbecue place, I cannot order pulled pork sandwiches because I can't stand, like, the concept of pulled and meat going together don't work for me, right? And if you ask yourself, like, well, what the heck does this have to do with interviewing? It actually is a really good way to picture the challenge that our brain often runs into in an interview setting. I just changed the slide and put up a new picture. And as you look at this picture of this mask, I'd love for you, again, drop in the chat for me, what are the first things that come to mind when you look at this particular picture? And just drop your thoughts in the chat. What are the first things that come to mind when you look at the picture on the screen with this mask? I'll give everybody a moment to respond so that you can see that. I'm seeing a lot of, right, the ideas of often scary things come to mind. And the reason that I love this particular example is it is not uncommon that, in fact, I used this in a class years and years ago. I was in Phoenix teaching this class, and majority of the people in the class were from the southwest portion of the United States, places where it was warm. And everyone in the class said things like, burglar, mugger, robber, right? Like negative connotations with this sort of ski mask, particularly if you're from the southwest corner of the United States and it's really warm. If you saw somebody walking down the street with a ski mask on, you would think bad things, right? On the flip side, so this class had probably about 15, 16 people in it, and most of them from that part of the country. So they all went negative. I had so many people calling out bank robbers, right? Mugger, bad things. And I happen to know that the one gentleman in the class was from Minneapolis. And I'll never forget Mike Peterson sitting there at the end of the desk looking at everybody like, what is wrong with you people? And I knew he was from Minneapolis. No one else did. And I asked him, I said, so Mike, what came to mind for you? And he's like, it's Tuesday in February. I just wore that mask last week. Why do you all think I'm going to rob a bank? And the reality is, right, that we do have these filters that come to mind based on our prior experiences, based on like just trains of thought that our brain has put into place. And for Mike, that mask meant it's cold outside or I'm going snowmobiling because that was his experience. On the flip side, everybody else is thinking they're about to get robbed. This is an important concept when we talk about this from a perspective of interviewing, because when we go into interviews, all of those filters that we have in our brains play a role in our ability to select the right person. And if we don't take the right approach to interviewing, then all of those filters get in the way of us actually making the right hiring decision. And so while we often think about, I'm supposed to ask questions and there's information I've got to get, before we even start asking a question, we have to set ourselves up for success in getting rid of what are the filters that we might be carrying into the conversation with us that would impact that reality. I'll give you an example that just came out of a client discussion last week. I had a client a couple of months ago who called me up and said, Katie, small landscaping business, they're probably $7-8 million business. He's like, I have this opportunity to hire a general manager. And he said, and I've got somebody who fell into my lap that I'm hearing from other folks. He's great. He's a referral from somebody I know. He says he's done this before. I want to hire this person. Like, great. Like, that's wonderful news. And he said, but can you interview him for me? Because I want your read. So I interviewed the candidate and I had some serious concerns. Everything from some of the information on his resume was actually not accurate, which was a pretty big flag. Told me he had a degree, resume says he had a degree. He told me in the interview he did not. There were other things, right, where his stories, when he said he had done certain things, when I asked for examples, he couldn't give me enough meat on the bones to help me feel like he actually had that experience. And so I called the client after the interview and I said, I have concerns. I'm not sure I would, if this person were just coming to me and I was doing the hiring for you, I wouldn't recommend that he move forward in the process. And I shared the why. And the client quickly was like, but this person referred him and this person said he's great. And so I'm going to overlook all of what you said and go ahead and make the hire. Right? Because the filters of the referral and the who he knows, all of that kind of outweighed the actual facts of the candidate in the interview told me he falsified his resume. So it's kind of the extreme of filters can go both positive and negative along the way. But what you get out of the interview really is what should guide your decision making instead. Now, lo and behold, I actually talked to the client last week, and turns out candidate's willingness to sort of stretch the truth continued into his employment. He created quite a bit of havoc within the team, and it's been about 2.5 months, and they just let him go. So again, when we make decisions based on our gut or based on these filters that we have, we often miss the accuracy of the hiring decision. I'm going to give you another example as to how this works. So I just put a new picture up on the screen. What I want you to do is I'm going to give you about 15 seconds. And in those 15 seconds, what I want you to do is look at this picture and think about find all of the pink things that you can in this picture. So you can make a list, you can write it down, you can count them up, but your job in the next 15 seconds is to find all of the pink things in the picture. I'll give you a couple of seconds more. Again, all of the pink things. So now that you've had a couple of seconds to find all of the pink things, I'm going to ask you some questions about the picture without it up in front of you. And I want you to write your answers to the questions into chat so that we can see where we come from. So first question, what was on the floor at the foot of the bed? Go ahead and write your answers into chat. Second question, what 2 items were on the dresser at the foot of the bed? Third question, what was on the floor in front of the window? And fourth and final question, what 2 items were on the bed? So if some of you may be at this stage kind of scratching your head going, I didn't know any of those, because you might not have been looking at the right things. So in order to not drive you crazy, I will go back to the screen so that you can see these, and I'll give you some answers. Let's see what came in on chat in terms of answers to the questions. We did get a panda. So Chris got the first one right. What's on the floor at the foot of the bed is our panda. On the dresser at the foot of the bed was a picture frame and a lamp. On the floor in front of the window is the vase with flowers. And on the bed, we either had the laptop and the phone or the pillow and the blanket. So I'm curious if folks could write in the chat for me, how did you do on that exercise overall? You've got choices of, I got them all 4 right. Second choice, I got some but not all. Third choice, I think I was looking at the wrong picture. Go ahead and tell me how you did on that particular exercise, and then we'll have an opportunity. So 1 of 4, Chris, great, thank you. Another one, sort of 1 of 4. Yeah, that's pretty common. And if you think about it, right, I always ask folks, well, why was it so hard? You had all that time to look at the pictures. And Chris, I love that, like, you even put in the chat all of the different things that were pink. Well, the challenge is I gave your brain a filter, right? I told you to look at what's pink, and then I asked you questions about everything that wasn't pink. The problem is in interviewing, same thing can happen. We go in thinking we're going to be looking for one thing, or we think we've seen the thing, and all of a sudden the interview kind of morphs around it and becomes the reality. And yet we didn't actually ask all of the right questions. The key to this is this concept of unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is really, it's a very natural thing. It's our only way our brains can operate. There's so much information coming at us at any given time. There's smells, there's scents, there's visual things, there's audio, right? We've got all of this coming at us. And it's our job to make decisions at the drop of a hat. Interviews, whether or not I go right or I go left, do I put my foot on the brake or on the gas, right? Your brain has to work quickly or it implodes or bad things happen. The problem is we get really used to just operating this way, and suddenly we make decisions on things that might not be reality, but it's the way that our pathways have learned to filter information over time. in interviewing, this plays a key role because once I go into that interview with my pink filters, suddenly all of the information that I take away from the candidate discussion matches those filters, right? And so we have to realize that this has an impact. It's one of the reasons that we end up with hiring mistakes, is because we're looking for information that reinforces those filters, and we don't necessarily listen for all of the details that we need. Similarly, I put 5 pictures up on the screen. Your job in this exercise is to pick the candidate that you get to pick your financial advisor. The only challenge is all you have to pick from is these pictures. You get no additional information. Based on this, which person would you pick? Go ahead and write their name in the chat so that I can see who gets picked. But tell me who you would pick if all you could go by from was the picture. Who would you pick? This is always one of my favorites because it's always interesting to see where people came from. We've got 2 who went for Jim. Got a couple more that are still typing in their thoughts, right? But if you think about it, pay attention to why, right? So it's not only who you picked, but what went through your mind. Oftentimes when folks tell me they picked Jim, right, they're like, he just looks like a financial advisor. I always laugh. He has kind of that realtor pose in his picture, so it works. I've got one who picked Rochelle. Oftentimes when people pick Rochelle, they tell me she looked friendliest, right? She looks confident but friendly. Other times, right, like John gets picked sometimes because John looks like casual but knows what he's doing. So some folks feel like the confidence of being casual makes it. Other times, John is like out for people right off the bat because they're like, he couldn't dress seriously enough for my conversation. He won't take good care of my money. Interestingly enough, the one picture that gets picked the least frequently is Paul. In fact, I think I probably have done this exercise a good 500 times based on the number of times I've taught this session over 10 years. I can count on 2 hands the number of times that Paul gets picked. And if Paul does get picked, it's usually because somebody says, Paul looks like he's maybe not all put together, and so he's not going to talk down to me. And you know what? He's probably like, he looks like he's like fighting for his next meal in terms of like how professional he looks. So he's going to be scrappy. Other folks will tell me they didn't pick Paul because he looked, in their minds, the quote I always hear is used car salesman. Ironically, Paul came out of a Google search for used car salesman. So even Google has unconscious bias, right? And we have to recognize that it's not, unconscious bias isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, we're not being immoral people, but if we're not aware it's happening, then it's influencing our hiring decisions both positively and negatively. That's creating a situation where we're not making smart hiring decisions. And so one of the pieces of information that I love to share around interviewing is this concept that we make 11 judgments about people in the first 7 seconds that we meet them. And if you think about what that means in an interview setting, right, that means in person, I've maybe shook their hand. I looked at their clothes from top to bottom. I said hello, and I probably had a conversation about the weather. In Zoom world, right, we've probably maybe just figured out technology. We're making sure everybody can hear each other. And meanwhile, I'm making all sorts of judgments based on somebody's background, based on, you know, the look, their hair, based on whether or not they're smiling in those first 7 seconds, based on all sorts of things that may or may not have anything to do with whether or not I am qualified to be a chief financial officer, right? And it's an important piece to understand because you add to that the resume, and the resume in and of itself feeds those unconscious bias for us. And so it's important that we have the right processes in place before we ever get to that interview to help make sure that we make the right hiring decision for the organization. The other piece to know about our unconscious bias or our stereotypes is they can be both positive and negative, and either one creates problems for the accuracy of your hiring decision. Examples of positive stereotypes often can be things like, right? Some folks love, like, hey, I love to hire veterans because they can follow instructions and they are devoted and they're loyal and they're all of these things. Those are all really great things to think about veterans, but not all veterans are actually qualified for your job, for one. And, right, like, not all veterans meet those criteria. On the same note, the one I see more often than not is the employee referral. If your best employee sends you an employee referral, sometimes we make that hiring decision on the spot. We just had a client a couple weeks ago who said, we just made that hire based on the person walking in. If they'd gone through your process, we probably wouldn't have hired them, but because they came in and they were a referral, we decided to go for it. Question is, did they actually ask all of the right questions, or did they go with a gut because of the person that was the referral? On the flip side, negative examples of stereotypes, right, sometimes can be what school somebody went to, what was their major, what company did they work for previously. I've had people who are like, oh, don't hire from that company because they don't care about quality, and so anybody from that company wouldn't care about quality. Well, I'm guessing if they're leaving the company, maybe they're leaving because they aren't aligned on quality and they actually want to go somewhere that cares more about quality going forward. And so we have to be really cautious about how this plays in to our day-to-day decisions. When we don't do this, what it creates for us again is it skews our perspectives and it creates inaccuracy in our hiring decisions. So in order to overcome them, the good news is there's a lot of things that we can do. But most importantly, it's about having a great interview process. So many people walk into an interview and they may not even know what they're going to ask. They certainly haven't thought about what's the right answer to what I'm going to ask. And it leads us to kind of be rolling the dice. We also sometimes ask questions that aren't particularly helpful in really understanding a candidate's background. Tell me about your strengths. My favorite and least favorite all at the same time. If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? That one's not made up. I was sure this was a myth for most of my career. And in my first year in consulting, I was within 12 months of leaving Fortune 50 company. And I had a client send me their interview guides and they said, we're just having a really hard time getting the right hires. We're having a lot of turnover. And I said, well, send me your interview questions and let me see what you're asking and how that could happen. And that was actually a question on their interview guide. The good news is sometimes in consulting, we make it easy for the consultant to tell you what to do differently. But also, right, sometimes it's as easy as, accuracy is important in this role. Are you detail oriented? Well, nobody's going to tell you no, right? So you didn't learn anything about the candidate. And interviewers get caught up in these kinds of questions and they'll call us afterwards and be like, well, they told me they were super detail oriented. So that's a really good thing. And I'm like, well, of course they told you that. That's the point. And so again, it feeds our biases. And now we don't actually know the information we need to make an accurate hiring decision. Instead, we should be thinking about assessing competencies. So in an interview, if somebody says, I'm a people person, but on the job, you're finding that they're screaming at people, it's because you didn't actually look at competencies. You took kind of a high-level statement and said, oh, well, they must be good. Right? In some cases, an interview will say, I'm extremely organized. And if we take that at face value, but on the job, their office looks atrocious, it's because we took a platitude, we took a statement and just let it feed our thoughts about that particular candidate. The reality is what we need to do in order to get to best hiring decisions is behavioral interviewing. And the concept behind behavioral interviewing is that our past behavior predicts our future behavior. So how we handled something in the past is likely to be how we will approach that same situation in the future. Now, that doesn't mean that as human beings, we don't learn things, right? So you can ask multiple questions and multiple examples to see how they handled things differently at different points in time or in different settings. But the reality is, we don't often just wake up and go, yesterday I did it like this, and today I'm going to try something totally different. And so the idea in the interview process is you're trying to get this information around what was their past behavior in situations that were similar to the circumstances that you will have in your company. Now, there's also really specific areas that we want that to be the case. The first piece is technical knowledge. So this is, does the person know how to do the job, right? Do they have the skills and experience needed to do the job well? The second piece is competencies. And these are things like customer service. These are things like detail orientation. These are the how somebody does the job. Technical experience is about what they do. Competencies is about how they do it. And then the third piece we need to assess is what is the motivational or organizational fit? We're going to dive into that one pretty distinctly because this is often the kinds of things that lead our biases, and we have to understand what is it we're actually trying to judge for. But let me give you a couple of examples. So first of all, technical skills is pretty easy to think about, right? Do they have the degree? Do they have the certification? Do they have the number of years of experience you need? Technical skills you can kind of use a checklist for. You might have in some industries some technical questions, but it's the what they do part. How they do it is super important though, because this is, right, there's a difference between somebody who is detail oriented in one role, but maybe not detail oriented enough for this particular role. Or on my team, right, recruiters can have a ton of technical experience, but one of the major challenges for individuals that join our team as talent advisors is for the first time, like they get to handle their own positions from beginning to end, but they have to collaborate with one another very heavily. And they have to collaborate with the people on our HR side of the team as well. And so people who are used to like operating in their own silo find it really difficult to operate within our team, and it often doesn't appeal to them. So when we're interviewing for our talent advisors, collaboration is something that's really important. And I can tell you, I interviewed a ton at Progressive for recruiters, and never once did I ask somebody a collaboration question because it just wasn't important in their space. So one of the things that you need to do early on in the process, before you ever meet a candidate or look at a resume, is think about what are the competencies that this individual needs in order to be successful in the role. And if we can narrow it down to the top 7 or 8 competencies that are most important for this role, now you have the opportunity to be successful in assessing whether or not somebody is actually the right person for the role. Once we have competencies, then we have to think about this concept of motivational fit and cultural fit. And again, this is often the kind of stuff that people will say like, well, my gut tells me. Well, we can't go with our gut, but we can put some concepts to our gut that help our gut be far more effective, and more importantly, more like on point with putting aside the filters and really finding out whether or not somebody is going to enjoy the job and enjoy the culture. And the easiest way I can share this is to think about, for that particular role, what are the things that people like and dislike, right? So if I'm interviewing a candidate, what does that person tell me they love doing and what do they hate doing? And on the flip side, how often will they do that at this company, right? If I like doing something and I get to do it all the time, I'm going to be really happy and I'm going to stick around. On the flip side, if I don't like doing something, I have to do it day in and day out, probably not going to last very long, am I? Also, if I dislike doing something and I never have to do it, like that may be the job I stay in forever, right? I have one of my team members who's on the HR side. She does not like recruiting. And when she joined me 7 years ago, I was able to say, you will never have to recruit. You won't ever touch a rec. And she was like, fantastic. And it's a lot easier to keep her happy every day because as long as I keep saying, you never have to do that, she's really ecstatic because there's not a lot of HR jobs out there that can say that every day. On the flip side, if you really like to do something and you never get to do it, you're going to miss it. And eventually you're going to be like, gosh, I really have to get back to that. Me at Progressive after 12 years was exactly in that spot, right? I loved pure like employee relations and HR strategy kind of work partnering with a business partner. And in my role as director of recruiting, while I loved so much about it, I really got to the point I was missing that pure like HR employee relations type of work. And I needed to get back to it. I was feeling like my cup was a little bit empty. Same thing can be applied from a culture perspective. So if you're really trying to make sure you make the right hires, some of what you need to think about is what are the kinds of things that happen all the time in your culture and what's never likely to happen? And how can you talk to candidates about that in the interview process so that then they can match it up with, well, what do I like and what do I dislike? And now when people join your organization, they're really happy with the kind of culture that you have. Not every culture is for every person. And part of what you're trying to get out of that interview process is this the right role for them, both in terms of their ability to do the job and will they like it? And also, is this the right culture for them? But we have to be really brutally honest with ourselves about what our cultures are, or we get this wrong. Now, sometimes we have clients who are in the middle of a culture shift, right? They're going from they've been this way, but they're trying to be this. That's okay, right? Like that's a real thing that we have to go through within businesses. The key I would say is if you're going through that, you still need to be really clear in the interview process of, first of all, what is it you want people to love about your culture in the future, right? We're 12 months from now, we've made this huge transformation of our culture. What do we want it to feel like to be here? And we need to be able to tell people that because somebody might know, they might work with Susie in your office next door and be like, well, Susie loves the culture. Well, great, but Susie loves this culture. Susie may not love the culture where you're going. On the flip side, though, you also still need to make sure that you tell that person, hey, we are in a culture transformation, because otherwise you're going to be in a position where, right, you've described the culture you want, but on day one they start, and that's not the culture that they see. And candidates really need this to be a match. Most candidates are okay if there's something about your culture that isn't great or something about the role that, people don't love. If you tell them up front, then it gives them the chance to make this choice. But if they find it out once they get there, now they feel a little bit bait and switch, or sometimes they're like, wow, had I known that, I never would have accepted that job. Now you've got turnover to deal with. Once you have these things defined, so before you ever post the role, right, you figure out the technical experience you need. You identify those top 7 or 8 competencies that you need. And you've got this concept of what is it that people like and dislike about the job, and what is it that people like and dislike about the culture. Now we're sitting there with candidates across from us, and it's time to ask questions. And the goal in your questions is about figuring out, right, how can we predict how this person will do in the role? If we think about it, at the end of the day, that's all we're trying to do in the interview setting. So instead of those horrible questions we were asking before, now we replace them with getting examples from their past behavior to predict what their future behavior will look like. So this is where we start to use behavioral interviewing. And I will tell you, when you do this well, you will get so sick of hearing yourself say the words, tell me about a time when, but it's tell me about a time you had to miss a deadline. Tell me about a time you went above and beyond for a client. Tell me what you liked most about your last job. Your role as an interviewer is to get them to share past stories with you. It's not about right or wrong answer. It's about getting as much information about how has this person done these things in the past? What does that mean for what they're going to like and dislike in the future? I'll give you an example. This morning, I was interviewing a candidate, and during the conversation, I asked her about one of her roles, and I said, tell me what you liked most about that work environment. And I was amazed. She was great. She was super forthcoming, right? And she said, one of the things that I found different between the two companies that I had worked for, she said, this is going to sound really petty, but in one of the organizations, I had an office and in the other, I didn't. And she said, having the office was really important to me. And she said, not from a prestige perspective. She said, but I found it really hard in the second role. I was distracted a lot. There was always background noise around me and people would just walk up to the cube, right? And I was always fighting the ability to stay focused with all that was happening around me. And she said, I just found it added a layer of stress for me. I hadn't even asked the question, but here's why that was so important. The client that I was doing the interview for, they have no offices. They are a large building with just open space. And so she would literally be working with probably on any given day, 8 people around her at open desks, and they all just like talk across the office nonstop. She would be miserable. And it might actually impact her performance, right? I didn't even have to ask it. She just starts divulging that she has no idea what their office setup was, but I did. And so just getting somebody to open up about likes and dislikes can start a whole new conversation. With the tell me about a time questions, like tell me about a time you missed a deadline, right? What you're trying to gather essentially are stories from people that help you see how did they handle something before, and how does that demonstrate the competencies you need them to demonstrate in this particular role. And the easiest way to do this is it's not just about asking me, tell me about a time. It's really about what answer is it that you are looking for at the end. And when we teach behavioral interviewing, we tell people what you're looking for is essentially the star. These are the stories. So you want somebody to give you a very specific example of when did they have to do that, right? Last Tuesday, I was working with Mr. Smith, and Mr. Smith was upset because of our policy on X, Y, or Z. Well, now I actually know how you're going to handle a Mr. Smith that you're likely to meet in this particular job, right? Then I need information about the actions. So what did you do when you met Mr. Smith? And you will be surprised how many times somebody will be like, well, I told Mr. Smith where Mr. Smith could go. He was out of line. He was inappropriate. Other times I will hear people say, you know what, I just handled it. Well, handling it doesn't tell me what you actually did. So now it's my job as an interviewer to ask follow-up questions and find out what does handle it mean for you. And then in the last section, you do want to find out, like, what happened with Mr. Smith, right? Did it go well? Did Mr. Smith write you a thank you note? Did Mr. Smith call your manager, right? You need to understand all parts of the story. Now, a lot of times candidates and interviewers will get stuck in that situation or task, and they tell you all sorts of information around the situation. And as an interviewer, it's easy to get wrapped up in that and forget that the information you actually need is about the action, because it's in the action information that you're going to understand, did they demonstrate the competencies the way you want them demonstrated at your organization? One of the easiest examples I can share is one of my favorite questions around customer service is, tell me about a time you went above and beyond for a customer. And I ask it that way specifically in a customer service question because for every one of our clients, what does above and beyond mean looks different, right? If you interview somebody from Nordstrom's, especially back in the day, or Disney, right? Their above and beyond is typically way above and beyond. So when they give an example, they pour into, here was the mark of what great service looked like and what above and beyond looked like. And let me show that to you. But if I have a bias that, all Disney people are great in customer service, I guarantee you I'll make a bad hire. So I have to actually hear what was it that they did that they felt was above and beyond, right? And that's where I'll know maybe they were the Disney person that got fired because their above and beyond wasn't up to Disney's expectations. This is how behavioral interviewing and those unconscious bias can come together in a really important way for you to be able to actually assess the candidate. So you're looking for an actual story. Now, sometimes you will have candidates who will share with you high level platitudes. Oh, that happens all the time. I always just do this, or I would do this, or my team always handles that. Well, you don't want to know how the team handles it. You want to know how they handled it, right? And you don't want to know what they would do. You want to know what they did do. And so your follow-up questions as an interviewer become critical to making sure you actually learn what were the behaviors that they did, not what were the behaviors they wanted to do, right? And so this is one of those big paradigm shifts for most interviewers, because most of us go into an interview with the assumption that the candidate needs to be good at interviewing. And let's be honest, I don't know many jobs where the job, once you get it, is to sit around and be interviewed all day. So if you're assessing whether or not somebody was a good interview, you're assessing them for the wrong thing, because that's not the job. So instead, you're assessing whether or not someone demonstrated the skills and the behaviors you want in the job, whatever that job happens to be. And if you're horrible at interviewing, which I have seen candidates be horrible at interviewing, I don't care, because hopefully you're never going to interview again, because you're going to stay with me along the way. Instead, as the interviewer, it is your job to make sure you get the information you need to assess whether or not they have the skills and abilities to do this job. So it's your responsibility to be a great interviewer, not the candidate's responsibility to be great at it. The way you do that is by being smart about your follow-up questions. First, we ask great behavioral questions. Tell me about a time when, walk me through a scenario where, right? And then when they don't give you a specific example, they say things like, well, I would do that, or that happens all the time and here's what I do. But they didn't tell me about Mr. Smith, right? Now I ask the question to say, it sounds like you really know how to handle that. Can you tell me about one in particular where you took that particular approach, and how did it work out? Or when a candidate's really struggling, because this is harder than you think it is to do, and they're struggling for the example, you stop and say, you know what? I can tell you've run into this a lot. Stop and picture the last time it happened. Tell me about that one. Right now, I'm helping the candidate get to the story that I want to hear. And essentially what this means is that you as an interviewer, you're kind of walking through this interview holding a basket. And your job in the interview is to pick up stories from the candidate to fill your basket, so that at the end, you can look back and say, okay, I needed the person to have these 3 technical skills and these 8 competencies. How did they do towards those things? And if I can get that right, now I've increased the chances of an accurate hire tenfold. The last piece then is, right, you're also looking for that motivational fit and that culture fit. And you can pick those things up with simple questions like, walk me through, like, what did you like most about that job? What did you dislike about that job? Which of your roles did you love the most and why? The role that you stayed at the longest, but you didn't love, what made you stay as long as you did, right? Again, get people to tell you stories, and now you can actually see into them as a person, and you'll have a much better chance of improving your results on the hiring end. Keep in mind, when you're doing behavioral-based interviewing, focus on the action section. Once you get them telling you about a specific example, everything else you ask for follow-up questions is important, and you want to go deep, right? If they just say, well, I handled it, or I took care of them, that doesn't give you enough, because it doesn't tell you how. So instead, you want to say, like, well, what did you do next? How did that work out? How did that match your company's policies? What other options did you consider? Your job is to get into their head and see, like, what was their thought process, so that you can assess whether or not they have the competencies you need for them to do the job. You can see this for many clients. This is a really big shift in putting some science behind the art of interviewing. And it's always a little bit of science and a little bit of art. But if we just start going with our gut, or I've seen this all the time, and this is like so-and-so who we interviewed, we're bound to make bad decisions. The number of times somebody called and said, I didn't get a lot of information from them in the interview, but they reminded me of the guy that was here for 10 years, and that person was great. And I'm like, well, did they remind you of him because of something tangible or because their haircut was the same, right? So if you find yourself doing interviews but not able to put your finger on why yes or why no, it's a sign that it's time to start rethinking your approach. From a best practice perspective, first and foremost, knowing those competencies for each of the roles in your organization is key. So doing the work on the front end to say, what does success look like? Sometimes what does success look like to be good in this culture at all? And certainly within that role is really like, that's a key component to your success. If you're walking around blindly wondering, do I like the person or not? You're never going to get that decision right. The second piece is actually to create interview guides. Come up with what are those behavioral based questions? Tell me about a time when, give me an example of, that are going to really fit and help you assess those competencies that you're looking for. And then most importantly, train your interviews. Your interviewers are the key to your success. We had an organization a couple of years ago, it was a manufacturing organization that had never been through interview training before. We took probably almost 200 of their supervisors, managers, and senior leaders through interview training and had them practice behavioral interviewing and listening for the right answers and asking follow-up questions as opposed to just taking the answer that the candidate gave. And then really thinking about, how do we evaluate that? What does meets expectation in that competency actually look like? But if your interviewers aren't given the tools to know how to do this well, they're going to go either pull something off of the internet, or they're simply going to go with their gut. And their gut is likely, like, it might be right sometimes, but more often than not, it will lead us down a path of our unconscious bias filtering in. And suddenly we're making decisions on things that aren't going to help us actually get the right people in the role, either because they won't have the ability to do the job or because they won't be a good culture fit for where we're going. I would love to stop there. We do have a couple of minutes as we come to the top of the hour. And like I said, I love to leave time in this for questions for folks. So I'll leave a couple of minutes here at the end for folks to ask any questions that you may have. Also, one of the things that we do offer for any of our folks that attend our webinars, whether you be live or you watch the video later, we do offer free HR strategy sessions to those that attend our events, so that we can spend some time sitting down and talking about what are your challenges in this particular area and giving you some recommendations for how we can work together, and most importantly, like, what are some things that you could do to be improving your results fairly easily along the way. Most importantly, though, just for attending, we will send you the slides and a copy of the recording so that you can watch that as well. If you want to take advantage of that HR strategy session, simply email me at hr@peoplesolutionscenter.com. We'll set that up and have a conversation about either something that we talked about here where you're like, give me more information of how I do that in my company, or there may be another topic that you would like to have some additional outcomes from or recommendations on. I'll give everybody a moment here. Again, if you do have questions, I'm going to turn off the recording so that if anybody does have questions but prefers not to be recorded when we do those,